The soldiers had already given it a nickname: the Coffin on tracks. They said climbing inside it was like volunteering for your own funeral. Thin armor, a slow engine, a boxy steel body that looked more like a metal crate than a war machine. Many officers doubted it. Some commanders refused to deploy it at all. But in the mountains of the Pacific, where Japanese forces hid deep inside reinforced caves and bunkers, this strange machine would prove something no one expected. Because when bullets couldn't reach the enemy, when artillery shells bounced harmlessly off rock, and when flamethrowers failed to clear the tunnels, this weapon rolled forward. And when it did, entire cave systems that had resisted weeks of attacks suddenly went silent. What looked like a coffin became the most terrifying bunker breaker on the battlefield. Today, we uncover the forgotten story of the weapon soldiers mocked, until they saw what it could do. But before we continue, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps bring these powerful untold war stories to life. Now, let's step back to the brutal island battles of World War II. Fortified. By 1944, American forces pushing across the Pacific had discovered something terrifying about Japanese defensive strategy. They didn't fight the way many armies did. Instead of defending beaches openly, Japanese engineers carved massive underground networks into volcanic mountains and coral ridges. Inside these labyrinths were machine gun nests, artillery chambers, supply rooms, and escape tunnels. From the outside, many caves looked harmless, just a dark hole in a cliff. But the moment soldiers approached, hidden guns erupted from multiple angles. A single cave entrance could conceal dozens of defenders, all protected by layers of rock. Bombs rarely destroyed them, artillery often failed, and frontal assaults were devastating. Marine and Army units quickly learned that clearing one cave could cost dozens of lives. Flamethrowers helped, but even they had limits. Fire might fill the entrance, yet defenders deeper inside often survived. When the flames faded, the guns opened again. Commanders needed something new, something that could attack the caves themselves. That solution came from an unlikely machine, a vehicle many soldiers had laughed at when they first saw it: the M3 Lee tank. Unlike most tanks of its era, the M3 carried a massive 75mm cannon mounted in its hull rather than in a rotating turret. This design looked awkward, even outdated. The tank was tall, its profile made it easy to spot, and its gun could only aim within a limited arc. Because of these weaknesses, many crews believed the tank was dangerously vulnerable. Enemy gunners often targeted it first. That's where the nickname came from: the Coffin on tracks. Yet in the Pacific, engineers realized something important. The M3's hull-mounted cannon sat lower and closer to the ground than most tank guns, and that made it perfect for something unexpected: firing directly into caves. Instead of shooting from long distances like traditional tanks, these vehicles rolled slowly toward bunker entrances. Infantry followed behind them. Then the tank stopped just yards from the opening. The cannon lowered and fired high-explosive shells straight into the darkness. Inside those narrow tunnels, the blast had nowhere to escape. The shockwave bounced through the stone corridors like thunder trapped underground. Entire defensive chambers collapsed. Hidden machine gun nests were silenced instantly. But this new tactic came with terrifying risks. Because to fire into a cave, the tank had to drive dangerously close, sometimes less than 20 feet away. Enemy soldiers inside could throw grenades, fire anti-tank weapons, or rush out with explosives. Tank crews knew one mistake could turn their steel vehicle into exactly what the nickname promised: a coffin. Still, the strategy worked. Again and again, infantry units called forward the strange, towering tank everyone once doubted. And every time its cannon roared inside a cave entrance, another seemingly impossible fortress fell. But the real test of this weapon was still coming. On one island, surrounded by jagged cliffs and hidden tunnels, American forces would face one of the most fortified cave systems in the entire Pacific War. And that was where the Coffin on tracks would prove whether it truly deserved its reputation or rewrite it completely. The true test of the so-called Coffin on tracks came during some of the most brutal island battles of the Pacific War. By the time American forces reached heavily fortified islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, commanders already knew one terrifying truth. The enemy was not waiting on the beaches. They were waiting inside the mountains. Across these volcanic islands, Japanese engineers had spent months digging massive underground fortresses. These were not simple caves. They were carefully designed defensive networks. Long tunnels stretched through solid rock. Hidden rooms stored ammunition and food. Some caves even had multiple exits, allowing defenders to fire from one opening and disappear into another. From above, the terrain looked quiet. But the moment American troops advanced, machine guns suddenly erupted from invisible positions. Mortars fired from concealed chambers. Snipers appeared from holes carved high into cliff walls. Entire platoons could be pinned down by a handful of defenders hidden underground. Traditional tactics struggled against these defenses. Bombers dropped tons of explosives, yet the caves often survived. Artillery shells struck the mountainsides, but the blasts rarely reached deep enough to destroy the tunnels. Even flamethrower teams faced terrible danger. To use their weapon, soldiers had to approach within a few yards of the cave entrance, often under intense enemy fire. Many attacks ended with heavy casualties. Commanders needed something powerful enough to reach inside the caves themselves. That was when armored units began bringing forward the strange tank many soldiers still distrusted. The M3 Lee, its design had been criticized since the beginning of the war. The tall body made it easy to spot, and the side-mounted 75mm cannon limited how far it could aim without turning the entire vehicle. But in the Pacific, those weaknesses suddenly became advantages. The tank's large cannon fired high-explosive shells that were devastating in enclosed spaces, and when aimed directly into a cave, the effect was catastrophic. During one assault, infantry scouts located a heavily defended tunnel entrance hidden along a rocky ridge. Every time soldiers tried to approach, they were driven back by machine gun fire. The position had already resisted multiple attacks, so commanders called forward an M3. Slowly, the tank crawled up the uneven ground toward the cliff face. Infantry moved alongside it, scanning the rocks for hidden defenders. Inside the vehicle, the crew could hear bullets striking the armor. Metal rang sharply with every impact. Yet the tank kept moving. 10 yards away from the cave, the driver stopped. Dust and smoke drifted across the battlefield. The gunner adjusted the cannon slightly downward. From outside, the dark tunnel looked almost harmless. From inside, dozens of enemy soldiers were waiting. Then the cannon fired. The 75mm shell disappeared into the cave entrance with a flash of fire. A fraction of a second later, a thunderous explosion erupted from deep inside the mountain. The blast didn't escape outward. Instead, it surged through the narrow tunnels like a shock wave trapped inside a metal pipe. Moments later, smoke and debris burst from the cave opening. The machine gun fire stopped. When infantry finally advanced to investigate, they discovered the tunnels had partially collapsed. Several defensive chambers were destroyed, and the position that had held back an entire company was suddenly silent. Word of these successes spread quickly across the battlefield. Infantry units that once doubted the tank now began requesting it whenever they encountered fortified caves. But the tactic was still extremely dangerous. To fire effectively, the tank had to approach very close to the entrance, sometimes so close that enemy soldiers inside could attempt desperate counterattacks. Japanese defenders occasionally rushed out carrying explosives, hoping to destroy the vehicle before it could fire again. For the tank crews inside, every approach toward a cave felt like driving directly into a trap. One well-placed grenade, one hidden anti-tank weapon, and the nickname Coffin on tracks could become reality. Yet despite the risks, these tanks continued rolling forward. Again and again, they faced caves that artillery couldn't destroy, and flamethrowers couldn't clear. And each time the cannon fired into those dark tunnels, another underground fortress fell silent. But on one battlefield, the caves were deeper, stronger, and more numerous than anything the soldiers had seen before. Thousands of defenders waited underground, and the battle for those tunnels would push both the infantry and the crews of the M3 Lee to their absolute limits. Because the next assault would prove whether the Coffin on tracks was simply useful or one of the most important bunker-breaking weapons of the entire Pacific War. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had reached one of its most brutal chapters. The battle for Okinawa had begun. Unlike earlier island battles, Okinawa was not just a small volcanic outpost. It was a massive defensive fortress. Japanese forces had transformed the southern half of the island into a maze of fortified ridges, underground tunnels, and hidden artillery positions. At the center of this defensive system stood the formidable Shuri Line. Here, thousands of defenders waited inside deep caves carved into limestone hills. Their machine guns covered every approach. Mortars and artillery were hidden in reinforced chambers underground. To American troops advancing across the muddy battlefield, the hills seemed quiet at first, but the moment soldiers moved forward, the mountains came alive. Machine gun fire erupted from hidden openings. Mortar shells crashed down from invisible positions. Entire units were pinned down before they could even see the enemy. Even heavy bombardment struggled to destroy these defenses. Bombers dropped massive payloads across the ridges. Naval guns from offshore warships fired enormous shells into the hillsides. But when the smoke cleared, the caves were still active. Japanese soldiers simply retreated deeper into the tunnels and waited for the bombardment to end. Once the American advance resumed, the guns opened again. To break the stalemate, commanders began deploying the tanks that had slowly proven their strange value in earlier battles. Among them were the towering M3 Lee tanks, the machines once mocked as coffins on tracks. Now they were moving directly toward the most heavily fortified cave systems on the island. The terrain was unforgiving. Rain had turned the battlefield into thick mud. Tanks struggled to move across slippery slopes, while enemy fire echoed from hidden positions. Yet, slowly, they advanced. Infantry units moved beside them, scanning the cliffs for cave entrances. Whenever scouts spotted a dark opening in the rock, the signal was given. A tank rolled forward. Inside the vehicle, the crew worked in tense silence. The driver carefully aligned the hull with the cave entrance, while bullets and fragments struck the armor. The gunner lowered the massive 75mm cannon. Sometimes the opening was only a few feet wide. The tank had to be perfectly positioned. Outside, soldiers crouched behind the steel hull for protection. Then the order came, fire. The cannon roared. A high-explosive shell blasted straight into the darkness of the cave. The result was devastating. Inside those narrow tunnels, the explosion became far more destructive than it would have been in open ground. The shock wave raced through the underground chambers, bouncing off rock walls and collapsing defensive rooms. Smoke and dust burst out of the entrance. Often, the enemy guns went silent immediately. But sometimes the defenders fought back. On several occasions, Japanese soldiers launched desperate counterattacks. They rushed out of the caves carrying explosives, attempting to destroy the tank before it could fire again. For the crews inside the M3 Lee, these moments were terrifying. The tank's armor could stop bullets and fragments, but close-range explosives were another matter entirely. Infantry escorts had to react instantly, cutting down attackers before they reached the vehicle. The battle became a deadly coordination between infantry and armor. Step by step, ridge by ridge, the tanks advanced toward the cave systems. Fire, reload. Advance, fire again. Some caves required multiple shells before the tunnels collapsed. Others exploded violently after the first blast, sending debris and smoke high into the air. Day after day, the same brutal process continued across the hills of Okinawa. What once seemed like impenetrable underground fortresses were slowly being destroyed. And the weapon soldiers had once feared to ride inside was now becoming one of the most effective tools on the battlefield. The nickname Coffin on tracks was starting to disappear, because again and again, these tanks were doing something artillery and air power had struggled to achieve. They were breaking the caves. But the story of this unlikely weapon didn't end on Okinawa. In fact, its reputation would grow even further as engineers began developing new machines designed specifically for one terrifying mission: destroying enemy fortifications from the inside out. And the lessons learned from those dangerous cave assaults would influence armored warfare for decades to come. By the end of the battle for Okinawa, one brutal truth had become clear. The underground fortress strategy that Japanese forces relied on was incredibly difficult to defeat. Massive bombardments from ships and aircraft could shake the ground for hours, but many defenders simply waited inside their tunnels. When the smoke cleared, the guns fired again. Breaking those defenses required something far more direct. It required getting close enough to strike inside the caves themselves. And that was exactly where the once-mocked M3 Lee proved its unexpected value. The tank that many soldiers had once feared to ride in, the vehicle they called the Coffin on tracks, had become one of the most reliable bunker-breaking weapons on the battlefield. Its large 75mm cannon, mounted low in the hull, allowed crews to fire powerful, high-explosive shells directly into cave openings and fortified tunnels. Inside those confined spaces, the blasts were devastating. Entire defensive chambers collapsed. Hidden machine gun nests were destroyed. And underground strongholds that had resisted artillery for days sometimes fell after only a few well-placed shots. But the real story was not just about the weapon. It was about the soldiers who had to use it. Every time one of these tanks approached a cave, the crew understood the risk. To aim properly, they had to drive dangerously close to the entrance. Sometimes within just a few yards, enemy soldiers inside the tunnels could attempt desperate attacks, throwing grenades, firing anti-tank weapons, or rushing forward with explosives. Inside the steel hull, the crew often heard bullets and fragments striking the armor like heavy rain. The driver focused on holding the tank steady. The gunner carefully adjusted the cannon. The loader prepared the next shell. Outside, infantry soldiers moved alongside the vehicle, protecting it from surprise attacks. It was a dangerous partnership. Infantry needed the tanks to break the caves, and the tanks needed infantry to survive long enough to fire. Together, they slowly dismantled one of the most complex defensive systems in the Pacific War. But these brutal battles also taught military planners something important. Traditional tanks were not always the best tools for destroying heavy fortifications. The experience gained during cave assaults pushed engineers to develop specialized armored vehicles designed specifically for attacking bunkers and fortified positions. Some tanks were later equipped with flamethrowers, capable of sending burning fuel deep into tunnels. Others carried larger demolition guns designed to fire massive explosive shells. Even the famous M4 Sherman would eventually be modified into specialized assault variants used against hardened defenses. The lessons learned in the Pacific influenced armored warfare long after the war ended. Modern armies began studying how underground fortifications could be attacked more effectively, combining armor, infantry, and engineering units in coordinated assaults. Yet despite all the new technology that followed, the story of the Coffin on tracks remained one of the most striking examples of how a weapon can be misunderstood. At first glance, the tank looked outdated. Its tall profile made it an easy target. Its unusual gun placement seemed awkward compared to more advanced designs. Many soldiers believed the vehicle was simply too vulnerable for the battlefield. But war has a strange way of revealing unexpected strengths. In the caves and tunnels of the Pacific Islands, that unusual design suddenly became exactly what soldiers needed. A cannon positioned low enough and powerful enough to strike directly into the enemy's hidden strongholds. The nickname that once sounded like a warning slowly transformed into something else. Not a symbol of fear, but a reminder of how quickly perception can change when lives are on the line. Because sometimes the weapon people doubt the most becomes the one that makes the greatest difference. And in the brutal cave battles of World War II, the machine once called the Coffin on tracks proved that even the most unlikely tools can change the course of a fight.